So let's look at the first real humans, or Homo Sapiens Sapiens. So this is the period which is called the purple stage in spiral dynamics, and which starts about 60,000 before Christ. Basically, Homo Sapiens Sapiens means that this is a person who's aware of his own awareness, or what we would call somebody who's conscious. So these people already have a sense of abstract thinking, logical thinking, they can imagine things. So these people were mainly living as hunter-gatherers, nomads, but also as horticultural societies. So these were people who were just living in small groups of people. They had their little gardens, but it was not full-fledged agriculture yet. So basically in this stage, people are no longer living in small groups of 20, 30, 40 people, but it's already larger communities. It's basically villages, and these villages can be something like 500, maybe 1,000, maybe 2,000 people. So it also means that as survival depends on the group and social cohesion is important, you need to somehow bring structure to the group. And you cannot have everybody working with everybody and everybody taking care of everybody. So it's going to lead to a change in the way that society is structured, but we'll get to that later. And maybe the last thing that I want to mention in general about this stage is that it's also the time when the first type of art emerges. So we have rock drawings, pottery, and so on. So how do we know something about the sex life of these people? Because there is no written records, because we're talking about a period that started, let's say, 60,000 years ago, and lasted until just a few thousand years ago, and in some areas it just ended a few hundred years ago, and there are still a few small places where you can still find people that are living in this stage. So if there's no written records, what can we find? Well, first of all, as I already said, there are still some small groups of people that live according to the values of the stage. In Africa, you can still find some hunter-gatherers. Also in the Amazon, there are still a few of these horticulturalist societies. And in the late 19th century, but especially in the 20th century, there is a number of anthropologists who have studied these societies. So basically they have traveled there, they spend a lot of time with them, and they have tried to understand how the sex life of these people are. And for example, there's a few books that I can really recommend for people who are interested. And for example, here we have the Sexual Life of the Savages by Malinowski. This is about the Trobriand in Papua New Guinea. It was written in the early 20th century. But we also have Anxious Pleasures, which is about the Mehinaku tribe in the Amazon. Or similarly, a book by William and Jean Crocker about the Canela, another tribe that lives in the Amazon. Also, if you're going to look in peer-reviewed articles in academic journals, you're going to find quite a few articles about the sex life of hunter-gatherers in Africa, for example. So there is actually quite a lot of contemporary people who still live in this stage. The second source of information we have comes actually from travelers and missionaries. In the 16th till the 19th century, you had many European travelers, traders, and missionaries that went to all these new territories, and they were so surprised by the lives of the people that they encountered that they started writing it down. And quite often they also wrote something about the sex life of these people. Now, we have to understand that the observations of these people reflects more the point of view of the viewer than what was really happening. Of course, there's still quite some anecdotal evidence and some interesting stories that really give some food for thought, but we should not consider this as really some kind of scientific facts. And the third thing that we can also make use of to understand it a little bit better is that there are still some matriarchal societies that live today. For example, the Mosuo is a small ethnic group close to Tibet in China, and they still live according to certain values that must have existed for tens of thousands of years. Let's start with marriage and sex. In a small society with only 20-30 people in the group, it's pretty easy because the group is so small and everybody's taking care of everybody. But when you already have 500 or maybe 1,000 people, you cannot have everybody take care of everybody, and that's why you need to somehow have a different structure. And this led to the creation of smaller groups, which you call households. And marriage is basically the framework that settles these households. Now, when we are looking at these early societies, marriage was not a formal thing because there was no legislation. There were no formal rules, but there were definitely some kind of unwritten rules of how these structures would function and how they would interact with each other. And so basically these structures were based on informal arrangements of who is going to take care of whom and how to raise kids together. Now, in hunter-gatherer societies, there was no official marriage, there was no ceremony. Just the fact that people were living together, the cohabitation, was basically the proof of the existence of this household. And everybody else in the tribe would basically consider that these people were forming a household together. These arrangements could start and end rather easily and flexibly. This doesn't mean that things were very smooth. Of course, there was definitely quite some drama because also these people had their feelings and emotions. But we didn't have the divorces like we have them now with lengthy court cases. In horticultural societies, there the marriages were already a little bit more formal. There was quite often some kind of ceremony, but it was definitely not some kind of legal construct. So what kind of arrangements or constellations could these marriages look like? Monogamy is the one that we all know, and that's the one we think of when we are thinking about marriage, right? But there are different solutions as well, or different options that were used in the past. The first one was polygyny. This means that you have one man who is married or forms a household with 2 or more women. Now, we can say that this is some kind of macho attitude, or this shows that men want to overpower women or anything like that. But there are actually also some kind of practical reasons why people decided to go for this kind of decision. For example, if there was a small tribe or a society where there were many more women than men, then you somehow want to make sure that all these women have the opportunity to be part of a household. If, let's say, there are 2 times more women than men, then it would be logical that for each man there would be 2 women in the household somehow. It's also possible that, for example, because of hunting accidents or something like that, many men died and suddenly you have this surplus of women. So it was a very logical solution to dealing with this kind of very basic problems in society. And then you can ask the question, well, what about the other way around? Well, yes, indeed. There was also the polyandrous system, where you would have one woman who would be married or form a household with 2 or more men. Also here the same could happen because there are more men than women, or maybe because the man is not strong enough to provide care for his wife, so he decides to have a second husband in the family. Or maybe the man is infertile and he still wants to have somehow a family with kids, so he's going to ask maybe his brother to also become the second husband, or they may invite a younger and stronger man to be part of the household. You may be surprised, but this polyandry still exists today. There's about 100 different societies in the Himalayas, but also in Africa, where this type of marriage still exists. Of course, it is not a legal construct, but people still live according to these rules and fashions. And the last type of marital arrangement or constellation is polygynandry, or group marriage. It's a type of marriage which is extremely rare. It didn't happen very often, and even now you hardly come across this. But there are still a few places in Africa where you may find it with hunter-gatherers. Also here, it's basically a practical decision. Quite often when a group of younger people are no longer living with their parents and they decide that living with two people is maybe a little bit too difficult, too strenuous, they just decide that with maybe 2 men and 3 women, they're going to form their own household. So I think it is extremely important not to have a value judgment about these systems. People back then were not backward. They were not primitive. They were actually extremely pragmatic and down to earth. The decision to go for monogamy, polyandry or polygyny was basically based on their approach to maximizing their chances for survival. And of course, it's not that this was a purely pragmatic or rational approach, because people definitely had feelings as well, and there was definitely lots of drama. But it was not a romantic thing like we have now. The other thing that I want to say here is that we think that marriage is based on sex, and this is still what we have quite often now. I mean, in the past, if a young guy was caught having sex with a young girl, they were basically forced to have to be married. So now basically we can say that marriage is some kind of consequence of sex. But in the past it was very much the opposite. People decided to get married, and as a consequence of the marriage, they would have sex with each other. So what does this mean for premarital, extramarital and postmarital sex? Let's start with premarital sex. Basically, as there was no real marriage, but just people somehow living together, premarital sex was some kind of non-issue. Quite often, sex was actually part of the rite of passage. Basically, the moment that a young boy would become a man or a young girl would become a woman, there would be some kind of sexual rituals involved. And even before people forming a household, they could freely have sex with each other. And there it's very interesting to see what different values there were. Because 100 years ago, premarital sex was a mortal sin. You could eat together but not have sex. Whereas for quite some of these earlier tribes, you could not eat together, but you could have sex together. Let's look also at extramarital sex. There were quite some unwritten arrangements or agreements. Basically, sex happened mainly within the household, but this was rather flexible, and there were many very interesting concepts. There were many people who had lovers. There were different situations of wife lending, for example. So, for example, if somebody would visit a family, he would be allowed to have sex with the spouse, or if somebody would travel, he might take another woman with him for the duration of his travel. So there were many different types of very flexible arrangements, and there was no real sexual monogamy. Cheating, however, so basically extramarital sex without the consent of both partners, was bad in all cases. And there's a very good reason for that. Let's not forget that the basis of marriage in earlier societies was not about sex. The basis of marriage was just about access to care, about the ability to survive. So if somebody cheated, then this person would probably give access to these limited resources to somebody else. So cheating was more about a violation of this unspoken trust about how we deal with our resources in the family. Now, maybe a final thing that I want to say about extramarital sex is about orgastic rituals that took place in most of these societies. And basically, these orgastic rituals had the purpose of celebrating the power of sex. And it links very much to the topic of sex and spirituality that I will talk about a little bit more. But it's very important to understand that this kind of orgastic rituals were not some kind of profane sex parties. They were not gangbangs. It was not some kind of hedonistic group sex. No, no, no. These were very sacred rituals with very strict rules. Of course, we should not be naive. It was not that everybody was some kind of devout spiritual being. There was definitely also lots of carnal pleasures involved. And if we're then looking also at post-marital sex, well, there was no formal marriage, but just some kind of informal household arrangements. So also post-marital sex was some kind of non-issue. And after the death of the partner of the household, a widow or widower could easily move to another partner. So what can we say about prostitution? Well, in those times, the tribe, the clan, kinship was very, very important. So there was a very strong social safety net. So it was quite unlikely that somebody would be forced indirectly to have sex with somebody in order to get access to food and shelter and protection. But of course, there were always exceptions, so it must have existed. But something that's more interesting is the concept of spiritual or sacred prostitution. There were cases where a shaman was communicating with the spirits, and in order to settle a situation or to have some healing, the spirits were ordering the shaman to enter into sexual contact with somebody. And sometimes this may have been even homosexual. And again, it's not that this happened very, very often, but it did happen. There are some references to it. But the shaman got some kind of reward for the provision of these kind of services. So is this prostitution or what? I mean, it was not about some kind of carnal pleasure. It was more about fulfilling the wishes of the spirits. Another type of very interesting sacred or spiritual prostitution were these sexual rituals, where some women may have played a specific role, and in order to play the sexual role as part of the ritual, they got some kind of reward from the other people in the society. So let's now move to the topic of sexual orientation and gender identity. The norm was definitely heterosexual. Homosexuality definitely existed, but it was not really seen as normal or natural because it just did not fit the laws of nature. So basically, people were quite tolerant about this in most society, but it was quite often still frowned upon. Now about gender identity, which is maybe a little bit more interesting and not always properly understood, is that during this stage of human development, people were gaining stronger cognitive skills. So they had this ability for abstract thinking, and they could conceptualize ideas like masculinity and femininity. And they were looking at their own person. How do they relate to these concepts of masculinity and femininity? Now, does that mean that we had men who identified as women or the other way around? Well, most likely not. However, we're not sure, and there are different theories about that, but a lot of these theories have been abused. For example, there are many stories about Native Americans where men dressed like women or behaved or took the role of women, and women who took the role of men. But we don't know very much about it. And basically in the recent years, the concept of two-spirit has been used quite a lot in the LGBT community in order to somehow justify that gender identity issues already appeared a long time ago. But maybe they also exaggerate a little bit. I mean, we do not know exactly, because even just the term two-spirit is something that was just invented in 1990. The other thing is also about shamans, for example. Yes, shamans were sometimes dressing as women, but does this relate to their gender identity or something like that? Well, probably not, because most likely the first shamans were women, because women were the ones with the reproductive power. Fertility was all about the female reproductive system, And this was also why women had a stronger role in all these spiritual practices and rituals. And there is a theory that says that men, as they started gaining power, they also wanted to take over these spiritual practices and these spiritual roles, and they started dressing as women in order to trick the spirits. Now, does this mean that they were feeling like a woman or that they were in contact with their femininity? Again, we do not know. So it's very difficult to come up with a very clear conclusion, and we should be careful that theories are not being instrumentalized. Now, the topic of sexual education is a very interesting one. How did people know how to have sex? Well, first of all, still the same as before, just observing what others do. Sex sometimes did take place in public, but less and less. I mean, people started moving more into their houses, and quite often when youngsters would have sex, they would make sure that parents would not know, and so on and so on. The other thing was that sex was not a taboo topic. People talked about it very openly, honestly. So quite often kids would just hear when adults were talking about sex. Now, this does not mean that adults were just telling their kids how their parents were having sex and what they liked or disliked. No, it's not like that. They were not disclosing every single part of their own intimacy. But sex was not a taboo topic. Another part of the sexual education, and maybe the most important, was that when does a boy become a man? When does a girl become a woman? Basically, when they reach sexual maturity. So these rites of passage had a very, very strong sexual component. So quite often there was some kind of sexual ritual involved. And for example, there were rituals where a girl would have to undergo sequential sex with different men the moment that she basically turned a woman. Another element of sexual education is that quite often there was an uncle or an aunt of the family who would basically teach these youngsters something about sex. And it's not like the sex education that you and I may have had at school, where they're just showing some kind of pictures and some kind of biological explanation. No. These people, these aunts and uncles, would really engage into sexual intercourse, and they attach a lot of importance to the pleasure of the partner, basically. So really, you hear it right, they were really taught. I mean, it was a skill that was considered that you had to learn. Now let's move to the topic of sex and spirituality. Spirituality was basically born in this stage of human development. So spirituality is basically a result of the cognitive development of Homo sapiens. And in these early years there was no religion, but people basically believed in spirits. So there was animism, there was shamanism. It was the birth of the first rituals and superstition and so on. Now, very interestingly, people, because of their cognitive skills, were not just having sex, they actually started thinking about sex. And not thinking in the sense of that I want to have sex or being obsessed about it. No, more about conceptualizing, like, what is sex? And they did observe that there was some kind of correlation between sex and a baby being born. So they really saw this causal effect. So they saw the cause and effect, but there was no scientific knowledge. So for them, they observed something, but they couldn't explain it. So for them, sex was something magical. And everything that is magical is related to the spirits. So sex had some kind of very spiritual aspect. And they really understood that sex had a crucial role in this cycle of birth and death. Something else that they noticed was that during sex, people would be able to reach some kind of altered state of consciousness. This is what happened during these orgastic rituals. People would have sex, they would engage into intercourse until they reach a state of mind which is completely different. And why did they want to reach this state of this altered state of consciousness? basically because it is their way to be able to communicate with the spirits. And the final important thing of sex, also related to spirituality, is that people saw sex as an important way of bonding. They saw how it can lead to social cohesion. And for example, the Hawaiians, they even said that sex is some kind of glue for society. So if sex is something spiritual, if it's something magical, then it is only logical that sex will appear in spiritual rituals and that there is going to be some kind of reveration of sex and the sexual act. And we can really see that there is lots of evidence of that. For example, in artwork, fertility was glorified. Look, for example, at the Venus of Willendorf, which is this little statue of a woman who is quite fat, basically, but it really shows a woman who has the fat reserve which is needed in order to bear offspring. It's really about fertility. Also, the other thing about sex and spirituality was that the shaman was sometimes involved in some kind of sexual acts. Also, these orgastic rituals that were really involving the entire community. Again, this was not some kind of hedonistic group sex. It was a specific ritual with a ceremony leader and with specific rules. The last topic that I want to talk about is about sexual ideas, norms, and values. First of all, and I already briefly talked about it, is that sex was very much associated with the feminine. So it was mainly women in the beginning who were in charge of these spiritual rituals, and only later also men started taking over. A second very important thing is that there was a very, very high degree of sexual freedom. And it's very different from the sexual freedom we have now, because now when we talk about freedom, we basically don't want to have any responsibility. We just want to do whatever we want. Whereas freedom, sexual freedom in that time, was that people had a choice, but they were also very much responsible for the consequences of their own deeds. And freedom does not mean that there were no expectations or any rules in society. It's also very important that this freedom was there for both men and women. There was really, I would call it, equal sexual rights, and this was very much a result of the matriarchal values of that time. Another important difference from that time and what we have now is that there was probably almost no rape and no sexual violence. Basically, people lived in small communities where everybody knew everybody, or everybody was a relative of everybody, and there was no anonymity, so you would not be able to get away with something. Another very important thing is that sex was considered as a basic right. Many people of you may know about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says that every human is entitled to housing, food, and has the right to education and so on. Now, basically, our earliest ancestors, the first humans, also had some kind of unwritten codes or ideas about basic rights, and they considered that sex was a basic right. They considered that every human was entitled to have sex. So what about people who could not find a partner? And this is the very interesting part. Quite often in these societies, women who were willing to have sex with men who did not have a spouse, who did not have a sexual partner, these women would have a high status in society, because they were actually willing to sacrifice themselves. They were willing to give their own body for the support of other people. They were willing to contribute to the well-being and the survival of their society. Nowadays, these women would be slut-shamed, but back then they were really some kind of heroes. They were in the higher classes of society. Another thing was that sex was very, very important for these people, and it was really considered to be the source of the highest joy and the highest form of pleasure. Now, of course, they didn't have football on TV, they didn't have Netflix, there was no internet or no bars and no restaurants, so there was not much to compete with. And a final important value is that abstaining from sex was considered to be unnatural. So there was no concept of sexual asceticism, there was no celibacy. So maybe to close, I want to highlight that I have tried to describe the sexual life of the first humans as good as I could, but it's very difficult to grasp what really happened. I've read tens of books, hundreds of articles, but I may not still grasp everything because our mindset is so different. We are so much out of tune with nature, whereas these people lived in full harmony with nature. And the problem is that quite often people in our society, especially people who have lots of new age ideas, lots of romantic ideals, who believe in communist ideology, they have some kind of naive and delusional view of those times. They romanticize what was happening then. It may all sound very nice with all this sexual freedom, but people were having a hard time back then. It's not that they could do whatever they wanted, and they also face some difficult situations. I mean, just for example, remember the story that I was saying about women in their rite of passage, that they may have to undergo sequential sex. There were also many examples of societies when a woman was actually getting married. She just had to spend the whole evening and the whole village could actually have sex with her. So again, let's not try to glorify this. Let's just try to give this the right perspective.